Do you ever find yourself frustrated because you create and make and test so many candles and you feel like they all end up in the trash or just a complete failure? You're not alone. We've all been there, and that is the purpose of today's video. In fact, this entire video series coming your way. All right, guys, I'm on a quest. I am on a quest to figure out how to make the best possible candle with every single wax that I can get my hands on. We all use so many different kinds of waxes in the candle making community. They're all unique, they're all different, they all have their own pros and cons, and everyone will defend their wax to the death. It's because there isn't a definitive best wax out there. There's not a right wax or a wrong wax, they're just different waxes. And knowing that we all use so many different kinds of waxes, I thought it would be fun to start this quest, this journey with all of you to figure out how to make the best possible candle with all these different waxes. Hi everyone, my name is Wade Thomas. I'm the owner of Black Tie Barn Candle Company. If you are new to this channel and interested in learning more about candle making or running a candle business, or just interested in anything candles related at all, I would encourage you to subscribe by hitting the subscribe button below. And if you find any value or find this video interesting at all, I would appreciate you giving the video a like by hitting the thumbs up button below. But let's go ahead and talk about today's video. Now, when I say we're going to talk about today's video, this is really going to be a series of multiple videos on the same wax and multiple waxes. It will take some time, but we will get there. And I wanted to start off with today with a wax that I don't particularly use myself, as I mentioned, but a lot of you do, and a lot of beginners start with this wax because it is very popular. It is very well marketed. It is a soy wax, so it's attractive to new candle makers getting in the market, and it's just very easy to find everywhere. And that is Golden Brand's 464 wax, soy wax. So like I said, this is a very common wax to start with, but like all waxes, it definitely has its advantages and disadvantages. Now I'm going to highlight those each in this video, and then I'm going to talk about the process I did to put these testers together and what we're going to be looking for in this video. And again, there will be other videos focused on other factors when using this wax, but today we're going to be talking about the aesthetics, getting that beautiful looking candle. And the reason we're going to focus on that is one of the chief complaints with using 464 is the look of the finished product. What are we going to be looking at today? We're going to be looking at, number one, jar adhesion, which is generally not much of a problem with 464, but we're also going to be looking at the surface, the top of the candle. We're going to talk a little bit about frosting, basically the overall appearance of this candle and just working with this wax in some common jars. And we're going to be talking about a few things you could be doing or not doing that might potentially affect those outcomes. So I made 6 different test jars, at least for the purposes of this video. And among those jars, we used 3 different fragrance oils just to get some variety, because I will also be testing these for hot throw later as well, and 3 different colors. One is the natural color of the wax, and then I use dye in 2 of them as well. One is just because some of the characteristics we're going to talk about are a little more noticeable when the candle is colored, so it'll make it easier to see, but also just to help me differentiate between the candle testers that I made. A few other important notes to know is that I use the same fragrance load in each one of these, and that was at 10%. The reason I chose 10% is it's such a popular fragrance load to use when using 464 wax. I'm not necessarily saying that is right or wrong. You can use less, some people use more, but that is a common starting point, so that is the one we used for today's video. Now, I did use a few different wicks across these jars as well, but we're not going to be focused on wicking 464 in this particular video. That will come in another video, but I went ahead and put in a few different wicks just for future testing purposes. The other thing that was similar between these testers is that I did not preheat any of these jars. I know a common tactic used when trying to work on jar adhesion or creating good tops and things like that is preheating your jars and getting a slower cool. That is not the most practical solution, because as you grow and your product volume increases, it is difficult to maintain preheating that many jars. But a lot of people do it for quite a while. I wanted to leave that out because I wanted to focus on characteristics with the wax and the actual process that doesn't involve any other manipulation of the jars itself. So we did not preheat any of these jars. So what are the differences in these 6 testers? So 2 of our candles, these light colored, natural colored candles, are our baselines. Basically, they are our constants in this scientific equation. I also did one at a high pour temperature and one as a low pour temperature, because those are the 2 that you see most commonly recommended for using 464. Those will serve as our baselines. 2 of the candles I poured at a different pour temperature. I poured somewhere in between the 2 extremes to see what kind of impact that would have. And then the last 2 candles I also introduced Vybar. Vybar is an additive that, if you're not familiar with, I do have another video talking about Vybar in detail and what it's meant for. It's actually more of a binding agent, almost like a glue that glues the wax to fragrance oil, so that waxes can hold more fragrance oil. It was originally created for the purposes of paraffin wax that by themselves can't hold that much oil, but people have started to use Vybar for other reasons as well. Notably, Vybar also helps to kind of uniformly distribute additives and materials together throughout the wax. That can be fragrance oil, that can be dye, that can be other additives. Basically, it just makes sure that everything is evenly distributed and balanced across all of the wax. Some people will use Vybar because of the claim that it might increase hot throw. That is debatable. Usually that's the result of just adding more fragrance oil, but that is not, again, the focus of today's video. I do want to see if Vybar had any effect on a smoothing effect on the wax itself and what impact it would have on surface, texture, and jar adhesion. All that out of the way, and you got to see a little bit of the glimpse of me making these candles and making these testers just to keep you interested and make this not such a dull video where I'm just yakety yakking and you can see something going on while I'm talking. Now that those finished testers are made, let me tell you a little bit more of where we are today at this point. Well, these candles have set for a little bit over a week. With 464, most people would say cure for a week to two, and then you can really start your testing. Well, again, we're not doing any hot throw testing or wick testing in today's video. 1 week, over a week is plenty long enough to look at the results that we want to focus on today, which is surface, texture, jar adhesion, and things like that. Now, I do want to mention though, that the one thing that sometimes takes much longer to show up is frosting. If you're not familiar with frosting, it's that white crystallization that you see on the outer surface of the wax. You'll see it through the side of the jars if you're using clear jars, and you'll see it along the top of the jar as well. It creates this kind of white snowflake looking pattern sometimes. Sometimes it will also just make the entire surface kind of this opaque, chalky white color. It can have different effects, but it's not exactly aesthetically appealing or visually appealing to look at, but it doesn't cause any harm or problems with the candles. It's just something that we as candle makers and some customers would rather not see. But with soy waxes, it's almost impossible to prevent it forever. What happens is with temperature changes, both extreme highs and extreme lows, that causes a crystallization of the soy wax to happen, and it's going to happen at some point usually, no matter what you do. A lot of people will temporarily fix it once they see it with a heat gun, but by the time they sell it to a customer and the customer burns it, it usually comes back, or it will come back sitting on a shelf somewhere with ambient temperature changes. However, with that being said, that doesn't mean we can't try a few things to see if we can kind of hold it off a little bit. And that is why I'm a little curious to see if Vybar would help with that at all. We're going to take a look at that today as well. I just want to throw out the caveat though that it's only been about a week or week and a half. Sometimes the frosting will take much longer to show up. So I can't give you any definitive results, but I can tell you to this point so far the results that we have seen. By the way, I lied to you earlier. I told you that these two non-dyed natural color candles were our baseline. I forgot they are not. I actually made the baseline these two pink ones here. Those are the ones poured at two different extremes with no additives used or anything like that, other than one drop of dye just to make it easier to distinguish from the other candles. So let's go ahead and start with those. The last thing I want to mention before we get into too many details here is that I only used basically two jars here. I used a 9-ounce straight-sided jar and a small mason jar. The reason I started with those is they're just very, very common jars to start with, and a lot of what we see and learn from these jars can apply to other jars as well. Now, wider jars do behave a little bit easier than jars that are taller than they are wide. And so I wanted to use kind of a short squatty jar and then one that's a little bit taller than it is wide, because that will give us pretty good feedback on what we're looking for in today's video. But just keep in mind that there are tons of jars out there. It's impossible to test them all. So I went with a couple that are pretty common just for people to start off with. Lots of people use masons. Lots of people use these straight-sided jars. And in fact, these are very similar to jelly jars as well. So I think we'll get pretty good results that we can apply to other jars down the road. Let's take a look at these first two candles. Reminder, these are our baseline candles, no Vybar. What is the difference in the two? So this first candle was poured at about 160 degrees. That's a pretty high pour temperature for 464, higher than you'll see recommended often, but it is the kind of upper limit of a pour temperature you'll see for using 464 or most soy waxes. The first thing let's talk about is the jar adhesion. Now you're gonna see here, the jar adhesion is excellent. Again, I didn't do anything here, no heat guns, no preheating. The jar adhesion is great. Now you will see some frosting already appearing on the jar, or at least I hope the camera is showing that. The frosting is kind of, you're seeing it along the top, you're seeing it along the bottom, and even slight remnants of it showing at the top, although it's really, really hard to see so far. But there definitely is some frosting already beginning pretty significantly in this one. It does show up a little bit more in the colored candles than the non-colored candles, which is why I wanted to use some dye here. But so far, pouring at 160 really hasn't done anything in regards to frosting, but it does give you great jar adhesion. Now let's go ahead and look at the top. This is where I'm most curious because one of the major struggles with using 464 is very rough, bumpy, uneven tops that are not smooth at all. They're textured, they're almost cratered. Some of them end up with a cottage cheese look, and they also have a tendency to create major sinkholes. Sometimes you can see the sinkholes, as you can see a little bit of one barely poking through here at the top of the candle. But if we were to poke a skewer down in there, you would definitely feel kind of a cratered open sinkhole area, almost like a cavity. And what you would want to do, and what most people typically do with 464, is they open up that cavity a little bit and then they use a heat gun and fill in the cavity with the top layer of wax. That also helps to smooth off the top layer before you sell it. However, sinkholes do have a tendency to come back with 464 as it burns, and that is sometimes another drawback to 464 as well. So pouring at 160 hasn't done us any favors, at least to this point. We've got sinkholes, we've got an uneven, crusty, cratered top. It's just not visually appealing. This would definitely require some correction with a heat gun. Let's take a look at the one poured at 130. For some of our overseas subscribers, I'm doing all of this in Fahrenheit. You can see, again, perfect jar adhesion. Less noticeable frosting, which is interesting. So we definitely don't have any frosting developing yet. It probably is a matter of time, but nothing so far. So in terms of frosting, I would say the lower pour temp has done a little bit better, at least in this very, very small test group. The top, however, is no different whatsoever than the one poured at 160. They're almost identical tops, very rough, cratered. You've got some sinkholes forming. If we look at both candles side by side, you could barely notice a difference whatsoever. So what about our next test group? This is going to be the test group that we poured at a temperature somewhere in the middle, but still no use of any other additives. So no Vybar, we're still using a 10% fragrance load, but we poured at 150 degrees on both of these, and I did 150 on each, just because they're different jars and I wanted to make sure we got kind of similar results. Let's go ahead and take a look at this mason. If you take a look at 150 degrees, we still have great jar adhesion. This is going to be a recurring theme with 464. You pretty much have great jar adhesion no matter what you do. 464 is just great about that. And so that is one thing people absolutely love, is it's easy to get that nice glass adhesion to the jar. No wet spots or anything like that. So far looking good. You can't really see any frosting, but with non-dyed, it is a little more difficult to pick up. But eventually we would probably see some start forming if it was going to. Now, as far as the top of the wax goes, in this case, it's much smoother than the one poured at 160 or 130. So far 150 has shown a little bit of promise here. It's not perfectly smooth. There is a slight kind of wave to the top, but nothing significant. It just feels much better to the touch, and you don't see anything noticeable of concern so far. Now, if we take a look at the 9-ounce straight-sided jar, this one is a little easier to see the excellent jar adhesion on. Now, by the way, I normally label my jars directly with my test information. I did these on sticky notes because I didn't want to add anything to the outside of the jar, because I wanted to make sure it was very easy to see everything we were looking at. But anyways, perfect jar adhesion. Again, no signs of frosting to this point. Everything's looking good. The very top, perfectly smooth. A little bit of a bump kind of in one area sort of near the wick, but nothing I'd be concerned about. There is the potential for little sinkholes underneath. One thing I would definitely suggest, even if you go with this pour temperature or any pour temperature, is definitely spot check still. You still might want to poke a skewer, metal or wooden skewer down in there and make sure you don't have any sinkholes or cavities underneath the surface of the wax, because sometimes that does happen and you can't see it unless you actually search for it. I don't want to do it yet because I'm not done testing with these, but that is something I would still recommend doing until you're really comfortable with your process and are confident that you're not developing sinkholes. But so far, I would give the nudge to about 150 degree pour temperature, over pouring around 160 or pouring under 150. So far the 145 to 150 range is the one that I'm liking to this point. The last two candles we're going to look at are these ones that have a very light purple color. And the only difference in this is, once again, I did pour at that 150 mark because that showed some great results. The only thing different I did on these was I added 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of Vybar. Now with a Vybar, if you use too little, There's no impact. If you use too much, it's a very negative impact. In fact, you might not get any hot throw at all because it traps the fragrance in. So you want to use the proper amount, and that proper amount is generally somewhere between 1/4 teaspoon to 1/2 teaspoon per pound, or if you work in grams, that's somewhere around 1.5 to 4 grams per pound if you're going to use Vybar. So that's what we did. I used somewhere in the middle of that range, and we're going to see what impact Vybar had while also pouring at 150. Did it improve anything? Is it negligible? Is it even worth trying or considering? So let's start off with the Mason. Once again, we have perfect jar adhesion. Now this was something I thought might suffer a little bit with the addition of Vybar. Vybar is a hardener. It increases the melt point of the wax just a touch, which can be helpful if you're shipping during summer, although it only creases by a degree or two, but it does firm up your wax a little bit, which with most waxes will cause it to not have as good of jar adhesion. 464 is pretty resilient to that. Even with Vybar, I still had excellent jar adhesion. We'll see it on the other jar as well, but jar adhesion was still great even with Vybar. That's very, very positive because any other benefits are not going to be offset by a problem or reduction in jar adhesion. So far, everything's looking good with adhesion. I don't see a ton of frosting yet. So here's the exciting part. It's harder to tell without you feeling it the way that I am, but the top of this candle is perfectly smooth. No dips, no waviness. It's perfectly smooth. It has a great, almost kind of matte, smooth. Those two words don't generally make sense together, but that's what it feels like. It's very kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It feels very smooth and even. You can definitely feel it's a tad firmer, and maybe that's what's making it feel a little bit different on top, but no waviness. It just feels like the best candle poured so far. But before we talk too much about my overall feedback on this, let's take a look at the other candle. Once again, with the addition of Vybar, the jar adhesion seems to be just perfect with 464. Now, jar adhesion doesn't affect the performance of the candle whatsoever. Like, most of us know that, but it bothers us when we see wet spots or improper jar adhesion, and it really shouldn't bother you. You get used to it, and you just learn to accept it if you love your wax otherwise. But for those of you that are especially starting out, it can really be a buzzkill, and you hate seeing not great jar adhesion. So I get it, and 464 will make you very happy when it comes to jar adhesion. Let's look at the top of this. Once again, this is with the Vybar added, and once again, perfectly smooth. A slight dip around the wick, but that is totally normal when you're using any jar that is taller than it is wide. And that is because the wax is going to cool at the top and at the bottom, which means it has room in the middle to kind of shrink and contract. Wider jars are going to cool more evenly. A little bit of a dip sometimes with some waxes around the wick is perfectly normal. If it's significant enough, I would definitely probably smooth it off with a second pour or a little bit of a heat gun. But honestly, these two don't need it. It's barely noticeable at all. It's actually really, really good. No bumpy, rough cottage cheese tops, perfectly smooth. So these are interesting results, and it's also worth noting that both the Vybar candles and the 154 pour temperature seems to have done a better job at holding off the frosting to this point, but I wouldn't put much stock into that because fragrance oil can have an effect on frosting, and we just haven't given it long enough. So I don't want to give any definitive answers or results or feedback on the frosting, but let's talk about the rest. I am pretty excited about the results I'm seeing so far by introducing just a little bit of Vybar. That little bit of Vybar might have been enough to make the consistency of 464 a little bit better. Does it have an impact on hot throw? I don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see, and I will definitely let you know when we get to that video and we've had a chance to test for hot throw on all of these candles. And will it affect wicking? We'll find that out as well. But as far as the texture, the pour, the aesthetics, the appearance, the visuals, the surfaces, all of that, I would say Vybar is shown some promising results to this point. Again, if you're interested in more research or information on Vybar, definitely check out the video on the channel, and I'll try to remember to link it above. So let's talk real quick before we finish this up, why Vybar might be helping. Again, Vybar is evenly distributing everything and making the entire wax blend more consistent. It's making everything work together a little bit better. Is Vybar some type of magic card, silver bullet, ace up your sleeve additive? Absolutely not. It is not the thing. It's not some cure-all for your candles. No pun intended. But it does have its time and place. I've used Vybar in candle applications that made no difference whatsoever other than waste a little bit more money in the product. And I've also made candles and wax products with Vybar that only led to negative results. And that is why I don't like making any definitive claims or assumptions about using any product or any material or any additive in candle making, because it just depends on so much else, so many other factors. There is no one size fits all for anything in candle making. That is why I want to do this video series and tackle one wax at a time. Let's start with one wax and figure out the best way to make that candle possible, and then we'll move on to another wax, and we'll do the same thing with that wax, and we'll keep going on until we've covered a ton of different waxes. I hope you guys really enjoy this video series because I think this is going to be a lot of fun. But with all that being said about Vybar, and just because it's not, I can't recommend it as some kind of universal fix-all, I can say that it's showing some promising results, at least with the appearance and the visuals and the texture of 464. I will let you know if that changes over time, and once I get a chance to actually test these, we'll have even more feedback to go off of. But I hope you found these results interesting so far, and I would encourage you, if you have any Vybar, to give it a shot. Do a little bit of testing to see if you're getting the same type of results that I'm seeing so far. This is a small test group. This is a small sample size, but that's where you start. You start with a small sample size to see if you're seeing anything, and then we can take it to the next level. Oh, before I forget, this is important. There are three main kinds of Vybar. The kind of Vybar we're using in these is called Vybar 260, and it is a Vybar meant to be used for softer waxes, container candles, basically. There is another called Vybar 130, and it's for certain waxes with a higher melt point, like paraffin waxes or pillar waxes. And then there's another specialty Vybar that is meant for modeling candle waxes. We're not even going to talk about that. That aside, if you're going to try this out for yourself, the Vybar you'll be looking for is Vybar 260. Well, thank you for stopping by. I appreciate all of you for being here. Hopefully you found this interesting, and maybe you can use some of the information we talked about today, some of these results, and use them in your own testing, your own experimentation. But until then, I will see you next time.